The popular image of a medieval castle suggests a static monument, thick walls, high towers, and a final refuge against attack. What tends to be overlooked is that castles were not designed merely to withstand violence, they were engineered to manipulate it. Their purpose was not just to resist invaders, but to control movement, exhaust resources, distort timing, and ultimately force an attacker into decisions that favored the defender. In many cases, a castle did not need to win a battle outright. It only needed to make continued aggression impractical. This distinction matters because it reframes how medieval defense actually worked. Castles were part of a broader system: political, logistical, and environmental. Their strength lay less in brute resilience than in the careful shaping of space, time, and human behavior. Castles were positioned to control terrain long before they ever faced an army. A castle's defensive strength began before a single stone was laid. Placement was often the most decisive factor. Builders chose locations that amplified natural barriers: steep hills, river bends, marshlands, and narrow passes. These were not aesthetic decisions. They were calculations about movement and visibility. A hilltop castle forced attackers to advance uphill, slowing them and exposing them to defenders for longer periods. A castle placed beside a river could restrict access routes, forcing an enemy into predictable approaches. In regions like Wales or northern England, castles were frequently built to dominate valleys and roads, turning geography itself into an extension of defense. So, this emphasis on terrain had long-term consequences. It allowed relatively small garrisons to control really large areas without needing to engage directly. It also shaped settlement patterns, Towns often grew up around castles, not just for protection, but because the castle controlled trade routes and resources. In this way, defense architecture influenced economic and political geography for generations. Walls were not just barriers, but they were also platforms for active defense. The walls of a castle are often understood as passive protection, but actually, they were designed for active engagement. Height and thickness mattered, sure, but so did the ability to project force outward. Parapets, crenellations, and wall walks allowed defenders to move quickly along the perimeter while staying protected. Arrow slits were angled to maximize outward visibility while minimizing exposure. Towers were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, eliminating those blind spots where attackers might try to gather. This created what modern military theory would recognize as layered fields of engagement. An attacker approaching the wall was rarely facing just a single line of defense. Instead, they were exposed to multiple angles of attack at the same time. The geometry of the structure made sure that no approach was safe. Over time, this principle influenced later fortification design. Even as gunpowder changed the nature of siege warfare, the idea of overlapping defensive coverage stayed central. The bastion systems of early modern Europe can actually be traced back to these earlier medieval innovations. Gatehouses were designed as controlled killing zones rather than simple entry points. The weakest point of any fortification is its entrance, and medieval builders understood this with precision. Rather than attempting to eliminate this vulnerability, they transformed it into a defensive advantage. Gatehouses became some of the most complex and heavily fortified parts of a castle. Multiple layers of doors, portcullises, and murder holes created a confined space where attackers could be trapped and attacked from above. The path through the gate was often indirect, forcing entrants to turn and slow down, further increasing their exposure. This design reflects a broader principled defense through controlled confinement. By narrowing the space and limiting movement, defenders could concentrate their efforts against a smaller number of attackers at any given time. It reduced the numerical advantage of a larger force. This concept appears repeatedly in military history. Whether in urban combat or fortified bunkers, controlling the flow of movement remains a key defensive strategy. Medieval gatehouses represent one of the earliest systematic applications of this idea. Moats and ditches were as much about delay as they were about obstruction. Moats are often depicted as dramatic obstacles, wide bodies of water preventing access to the walls. In reality, many moats were dry ditches, and their primary function was not to stop an attacker outright, but to slow them down and complicate their approach. Crossing a moat required equipment, coordination, and time. During that time, attackers were exposed to defensive fire. Even a shallow ditch could disrupt the use of siege engines or ladders, forcing attackers to adapt under pressure. Water-filled moats added another layer of difficulty. They could undermine attempts to tunnel beneath the walls and create unstable ground for siege towers. In colder climates, even freezing conditions could introduce unpredictability, as ice might or might not support weight. The lesson here is subtle but important. Effective defense does not rely on absolute barriers. It relies on friction, small delays and complications that accumulate until an attack becomes untenable. Medieval engineers understood that time was often more valuable than strength. Sieges were contests of endurance rather than direct confrontation. Despite the dramatic imagery of assaults and scaling ladders, most castle conflicts were decided through sieges. These were prolonged efforts to cut off supplies and force surrender. Castles were designed with this in mind. Wells, storage rooms, and access to food supplies were essential features. Some castles had hidden postern gates that allowed for limited movement in and out, enabling communication or resupply under certain conditions. The effectiveness of a castle during a siege depended as much on logistics as on architecture. A well-provisioned garrison could hold out for months or even years. Conversely, poor preparation could render even the strongest walls irrelevant. This dynamic shaped medieval warfare in significant ways. Armies had to consider not only how to attack a castle, but whether it was worth the time and resources required. In many cases, bypassing a stronghold was the more practical choice, though this carried its own risks. The emphasis on endurance also highlights a broader survival principle. Preparation before a crisis often determines the outcome more than actions taken during it. Medieval defenders, who anticipated a siege and stocked accordingly, had a decisive advantage. Hidden passages and internal design allowed for flexibility under pressure. While the exterior defenses of a castle were designed to control the enemy, the interior was structured to maintain flexibility for the defenders. Narrow staircases, multiple levels, and compartmentalized spaces allowed defenders to retreat, regroup, and continue resistance even if parts of the castle were breached. Spiral staircases, for example, were often built to favor right-handed defenders descending from above, restricting the movement of attackers. Internal doors and corridors could be barricaded, creating successive lines of defense within the castle itself. Hidden passages and postern gates provided options for escape or counteraction. These features were not always used, but their existence added uncertainty for attackers. A garrison that could move unpredictably was harder to contain. This internal complexity reflects an understanding that defense is not static. It requires adaptability. Even within a fixed structure, medieval builders created opportunities for movement and decision-making under pressure. Psychological factors were as important as physical defenses. A castle's presence alone could influence the outcome of a conflict. Its size, location, and reputation could deter attacks or force an enemy to reconsider their strategy. For attackers, the prospect of a long and uncertain siege carried significant risks. Disease, supply shortages, and shifting political conditions could undermine their efforts. For defenders, the castle provided not only protection, but a sense of stability and control. This psychological dimension is often underappreciated. Warfare is not only about physical capability, but also about perception and morale. A well-defended castle projected strength, even if its actual resources were limited. In some cases, castles fell not because their defenses failed, but because their defenders lost the will or ability to continue. Conversely, some held out far longer than expected due to disciplined leadership and effective management of resources. Failures in castle defense shaped future military thinking. Castles were not invulnerable, and their failures provided valuable lessons. The development of more advanced siege techniques, including trebuchets and later gunpowder artillery, gradually reduced the effectiveness of traditional castle designs. These changes forced a shift in military architecture. Lower, thicker walls and angled bastions replaced the high vertical structures of earlier castles. The focus moved from height to resilience against explosive force. This transition illustrates an important pattern in military history. Defensive systems are constantly evolving in response to new threats. What works in one era becomes obsolete in another, often quite rapidly. However, the underlying principles, that is, control of terrain, layered defense, logistical preparation, and psychological impact, remain consistent. Medieval castles represent an early and highly developed expression of these ideas. What castle defenses reveal about survival and preparedness? Beyond their historical context, castles offer insight into broader questions of survival. They demonstrate the importance of planning, resource management, and the ability to shape one's environment. A castle was not simply a refuge. It was a system designed to function under stress. Every element, from its location to its internal layout, was part of a larger strategy. This perspective has relevance beyond medieval warfare. Whether in modern security, disaster preparedness, or organizational planning, the same principles apply. Effective defense is not reactive. It is built into the structure of a system from the beginning. Understanding these structures helps explain the world they shaped. Medieval castles were more than military installations. They were centers of power, symbols of authority, and tools for controlling land and people. Their design reflects the priorities and constraints of the societies that built them. By examining how castles defended against invaders, it becomes possible to understand not only the mechanics of medieval warfare, but also the broader systems that sustained it. These structures were part of a network, political, economic, and cultural, that defined the medieval world. Remembering how they worked is not simply an exercise in architectural history. It is a way of understanding how people responded to uncertainty, threat, and the need for control in a complex and often unstable environment. If you value this kind of in-depth analysis, looking beyond the surface to understand how history actually functioned, consider subscribing to Hidden in History and sharing this video with others who approach the past with the same curiosity and seriousness.